Mr. and Mrs. Roy Baldwin remembers Estes Park. They are known as Roy and Hazel. This is taped at the Estes Park Area Museum, July the 7th, 1974.
We're particularly glad to have Roy Baldwin be the opener of this series because he has been active in the museum and the development of the museum all the way through. That scrapbook over there has excerpts right from the very first about Roy Baldwin's doing this and that and the other thing, helping with the building and moving things and so on and so forth. And he still comes over every week and takes care of the grounds and the building. Roy?
Well, as I guess you all know by this time, I came here in 1900. That's quite a while ago. If you're good at arithmetic, you can probably figure that out. And I lived out at Beaver Point, the old ranch house that I lived in when I was a youngster. It was only torn down just a very few years ago. This might be called then and now talk, with the accent on the then. And maybe to emphasize the difference, we should point out the things that we didn't have then that we take for granted now. For instance, we didn't have electricity, we didn't have telephones, the town didn't have a water and sewer system, and I could probably go on and on. The lack of electricity was made up by the use of kerosene lamps. And they didn't give a very good light, and woe be to the housewife that forgot to fill them with kerosene each day, trim the wicks, and clean the chimneys. Because if they weren't adjusted properly, turned up a little too high or something like that, you had to smoke chimney and you couldn't see anything. And woe be to the person that forgot to get some more kerosene when they went to the grocery store, because of course we didn't have filling stations in those days either. So most everybody had a can that hold from 2 to 5 gallons of kerosene, and soon the cap off the spout was lost and the grocer put a potato on the end of the spout. But that was just one of the daily chores. We didn't have many stores here, no bakeries. And the housewife really had a hard row to hoe in those days because she baked all the bread and other pastries that the family used, and usually had a garden in the summer. Most everybody had some cows and chickens to augment their income. But it was a hard life, you might say, but people didn't know any better though, so they didn't think anything of it. It was one nice thing in those days. Everybody knew everybody else, and also their peculiarities. I remember Mr. Ferguson, who owned the hotel, the Highlands Hotel it was called then, and it was between Beaver Point and where you break over the top of the hill where you can see Murray's Lake. It's shown in that picture. The hotel proper is gone there. But he was rather elderly man. He was straight as an arrow, and he had long white whiskers came down here. But each evening, or almost each evening in the summertime, he rode his horse out into the Thompson River and fished off the horse. And he caught fish. Now, some people, when I tell them that, they look at me, the climate had finally got me up here. But Mrs. Graves can authenticate my story. And I knew, of course, Enos Mills and his brother Joe and Abner Sprague and J.D. Stead and all the other big shots, because, as I say, everybody knew everybody else. If you knew their saddle horse and their dog and all that sort of thing. So we were more of a family, and it was kind of a case of one for all and all for the one. The roads weren't anything to brag about in those days. We didn't have blacktop roads. It was a saying then that if a logger was looking for more timber to cut, he dragged a log chain behind him, and that was a road then. But there were gravel roads. There were no cars, so it didn't have to be too good for lumber wagons to go over. Most men had a horse, a favorite saddle horse. And the man had a reputation of not being too good to his horse, why he wasn't thought too much of. The roads were pretty rough and pretty dusty, but there wasn't as much traffic, so it didn't matter too much. The housewife didn't have any electricity for modern washing machines or for an iron. Some had a hand-operated washing machine, and they were more in the luxury class. The housewife usually, from her chickens and butter, went quite a ways to augment the income of the family, and the garden in the summer. Most everybody up here had a small garden in those days, and the vegetables that were grown were very good quality. They had a flavor all their own. Warren Rutledge, that owned property out in what we called the North End, usually raised quite a lot of potatoes, and he had a ready market for them because everybody liked to get home with those mountain-grown potatoes. There was quite a bit of logging in those days. Most people don't know that a very great deal of the lumber used in the Elkhorn Lodge came from what's now a lower Hidden Valley. Howard James hauled lumber a good share of one winter out of there with a 4-horse team. And he had the misfortune to break a leg while he was up there one time, and how in the world he did it, I don't know, but he turned 2 of the horses loose and got the wagon apart and rode down on the front end of the wagon with the 2 front wheels. But he was laid up with a broken leg for quite a while. Most of the people then didn't have the tourist dollar to depend on because well, there just weren't so many people coming here. The roads weren't conducive to it, and the mode of travel, of course, was horses, either a stage or buggy or a saddle horse. So and the park wasn't as well known then as it is now either. There was the center of the social life in Estes Park, and the school was in one building which stood where the main part of the Estes Park Bank is today. That building, by the way, has been moved further west, and it withstood being moved a couple of times and 2 or 3 fires, but it was a sturdy building and is still doing business today. We had one teacher. She taught all grades. Probably some of the grades didn't have any pupils, and some of them had only 1 or 2, but all the grades were taught in that one building. Later, one winter, the school was moved out to near Beaver Point because there were more youngsters living in that area than there were down this way. And then, later on, there was a 2-room log schoolhouse built where the First National Bank is now, and that was later replaced by a more modern building with more rooms and more teachers. But schooling in those days was, by today's method, it was pretty obsolete, I'm afraid. The church activities, we had a preacher, Reverend E.J. Lamb, who lived up near what was later Longspeak Inn. And he got clear away from the pulpit. He didn't read any notes, and he preached hellfire and damnation for about 45 minutes. I used to get so tired before he got through preaching that I was wishing dire things to happen to him. And by the way, I might correct one fallacy. Most people think that Enos Mills built Longspeak Inn, but he didn't. Longspeak Inn, which is now, of course, a different name, was built by E.J. Lamb and for several years managed by his son Carlisle. But I don't know where the idea started that Enos Mills built Longspeak Inn, but he didn't start it originally. Then, of course, in later years, Joe broke away and built what's now the Craig's Hotel.
Question?
Surely.
Would this Mr. Lamb that you're speaking of be the one who came down Lamb Slide on Long's Peak?
I don't know. I presume so, because he was the only Lamb here in those days. Later, there were other families named Lamb that came in here. And he was a guide on Long's Peak and, of course, other areas for quite a number of years, he and his son both.
This would tie together then, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
I think too that Mr. Mills kept adding on to his original.
Yes, he did. He built on and enlarged it.
The old trees, that they burnt and all that.
He wanted to keep the place very rustic. He wasn't in favor of modernizing it in the way that we know modernizations now. He wanted to keep it very rustic, but he also was proud of having a good table, a good dining room, and his chicken dinners became very famous. I know in later years I took parties up there a good many times to enjoy a chicken dinner. Enos Mills was a man that was hard to get acquainted with. When you first knew him, you thought he was crabbed and short-tempered and all that, but it was his manner, it was his way. He didn't mean it. After you got to know him, why, he was warm and talkative and willing to express his views, and of course everybody knows that he worked very hard to get the national park established here. Can I answer any more questions?
I have a question. Didn't Joe Mills coach football at Colorado University?
I think he did.
1919. I think I played freshman football in there.
Yes, I know he was coach. Of course, I was so young that those things didn't impress me then. I was only 6 years old when I first came here, so these big people didn't impress me very much.
Roy, did you say that the first car ride you had was in Stanley's steamer?
Yes, that's right. I was a little barefooted, bareheaded, freckle-faced urchin trudging across Beaver Flat, and I heard a kind of a chuff, chuff, chuff noise. These steamers didn't make much noise, you know. And I looked around, and here was this gentleman and lady in this little car. It had tires very little bigger than a bicycle tire, and it steered with a tiller. And there was no windshield, and they sat up there very precise. And he said, "Sonny, would you care to ride?" I would. So he got out and took a key out of his pocket and stepped around in front and unlocked a little shelf-like thing that lets down, and that exposed a seat. And I got up on there, and my feet rested on this shelf thing. And that was the first auto ride I ever had, and I think I got the biggest thrill out of it.
About when was that, Mr. Baldwin?
Oh, don't ask me dates.
But you were still a little boy then?
Yeah, I was pretty
So it was
young.
Probably
I think
1910?
about 1946, right in there.
Where was your family home at Beaver Point? Can you describe where it was located for us?
Which home?
The place, the ranch house at Beaver Point where you live.
Well, it was a little west and a little north from the present Beaver Point store and the cafe and all that. Set back from the road, less than a quarter of a mile. And it was kind of rustic. It was comfortable. It was built out of mostly native lumber. And native lumber was very durable, but it had a tendency to warp and crawl away if you didn't get it securely fastened down. But there was a lot of buildings at first built out of that before they began shipping in.
Did you get your water clear from the stream then? Or did you
No,
have
we
it
had a
piped
well.
down somewhere?
We had a well
Had a well.
back to the west and north of that.
Mhm.
And it was, you might say a spring. It was kind of a fair weather spring if we'd had moisture in any degree, why the spring worked, but in real dry weather, long toward fall, why there was always water there, but not enough to run out, and we had a pump, and we could pump into a pipeline that was put in afterward.
Mhm.
But the first settlers here nearly all had wells.
Mhm.
Some had got pumps and pumped out of the streams, but it was mostly wells. The water was very pure because you knew there was nothing anywhere to contaminate it, and nobody worried about sewage disposal or that sort of thing.
About how-
Roy, you mentioned the sawmill in Lower Hidden Valley, and that the lumber for much of Elkhorn Lodge came from there. Is it also true that a lot of the lumber for the Stanley Hotel also came from Lower Hidden Valley?
I think a little of it. That was known as Stead's sawmill, and I think it was moved out long about in that time. Now, I believe that some of the lumber in the Stanley was hauled from there. And of course, Griffiths had a sawmill in they had it in various places as the timber was available, but for a long time they were up near Burstot Lake, and quite a lot of lumber came out of there. That road coming out of there was really a caution, and pretty steep, and they put on a very heavy load while what they made a rough lock on their wheels. It was made by wrapping chains around the wheels to cause more friction, and because a very heavy load would just run over a team of horses. In those days, they said it was a poor horse that couldn't outrun a wagon, but I'm afraid they couldn't do it on that hill with the road they had down.
About what was the total population of the area?
Well, I would hate to say what it was when I first came here. It couldn't have been too great because, I say, everybody knew everybody else.
150, 200 people?
Probably not over 100.
That's what I wondered.
Of course, we're pretty well scattered out then. Where the McGraw Ranch is now, there was people by the name of Miller living there. And the McGregors, that ranch was leased to some people by the name of Johnson. There was the older people and then 3 sons. And Stead's, and the Brynwood wasn't built yet, but Stead's, which later became Well, first it was Sprague's, and then Mr. Stead bought into it, and then later bought out Sprague entirely, and Sprague went over and built his own place to the south, where you probably all know about Sprague's Hotel. And up at Long's Peak, there was families living up in their area, and the Joneses lived where the chalets is now. But you see, we were pretty scattered out. And that is why you needed a good saddle horse.
Isn't that the picture of the schoolhouse on Thanksgiving time, and where you all met together and had dinner?
Well, that's it. I went to school there. That, as I say, was the center of the social life here. And at Thanksgiving or any other great occasion, why, everybody gathered there at the schoolhouse. And there were good cooks in those days, and they all vied to see who could make the best food to bring. It was all put on the table and served family style, and everybody was welcome, whether they brought anything or not.
Where the Ferguson Hotel was, somebody said that that used to be a stagecoach stop. Why would a stagecoach be going up that direction? You don't know that it was a stagecoach
Beats me.
stop. Yeah, I couldn't do that either.
I suppose maybe a stage would go by, but I don't know why they
Where
would
would
go.
it be going? Down toward Logs Creek Inn, or?
Well,
was
they
there
could go over in that
stagecoaches like
area,
that?
yes.
Yeah.
Didn't it go to Marine Park from there? Came over somewhere in the east, over towards the Mary's Lake area, and up to Marine Park before it ever came down into Estes Park, is what I heard.
It could be.
Now, this was very early.
I was going to say, about what time are you talking about stagecoach up here?
Well, Gloria May said that Charlie had said that he stopped there as a little boy. They used to give him cool milk when they stopped at that stagecoach stop, so, you know,
What would
you
that
could
be
figure it
about?
out from that age.
18,
I remember the stages coming in from Lyons mostly then. The trains ran as far as Lyons, and the stages met the people there. And they were four-horse stages, and talk about meeting the train, everybody liked to go and see the stage came in. And the drivers, they liked to kind of put on the show, and they got across the bridge, which isn't in the location it is now, but when they crossed the bridge there, they began to let the horses go and bring them in on the high run, and the tourists were getting hold of everything they could find in the saddle.
What year was the Stanley Hotel built?
It was built in 1908, I think.
When did he take over the operation of the steamers?
Well, the Stanley steamer, I don't remember exactly the year, but of course Mr. Stanley came out here for health reasons, and he became interested in the region, and he put a lot of money into improving the road to get in here, and then afterward built the hotel, and he saw the possibility of people coming in here, and he built some of the first 9-passenger vehicles and later the 12-passenger.
That was Roy Emery's gas wagons, the 12-passenger.
Sir?
Roy Emery took over the 12-passenger buses.
Yes, they still had some of them left when he moved in, and of course he installed the white gas car, not the white steamer, but the white gas car, and it was very successful. The steamer was a very efficient car, but not too many people could operate it. I happen to have driven a few Stanley steamers, but heavens no, I wouldn't know how to steam it up anymore. The steamer had smooth power, and you didn't have to speed up your engine to get more power. Had a very small engine, and it was geared direct to the rear axle. You didn't change gears. You had a small lever under the steering wheel, and that was the throttle. And don't open it clear up. Don't push that thing clear up because it might jump out from under you.
Ms. Baldwin, about when did the stagecoach stop making its runs up here? About how old were you? Were you still a little boy?
Oh yeah, I remember the stages, and I remember when they started using the Stanley steamers, but dates is my weakness. I suppose that I was, probably in the neighborhood of 10 or 12 years old.
When the stages stopped. And then about how long did they use the Stanley steamers?
Quite a number of years.
Oh, did they?
Mm-hmm.
Until about when?
Well, I remember when I came up in 1914, they were still using the Stanley steamers. They were lined up, 6 or 10 of them at the Loveland Depot. And the drivers were calling, "Take the Stanley steamer to Estes Park." I came up in the Stanley steamer one time, and of course, they don't make any noise. And, but they have a tremendous whistle. And there was a man fishing on a bridge. And so the driver gave a whistle when he got there, and he scared him so he jumped right over in the river.
Jack Lemmon was the driver.
Jack Lemmon was the driver, if anybody remembers that long ago.
How much for the ride from Loveland to Estes Park? Can you remember about?
I can't remember that.
I don't remember that. I remember later, a cash fare to the valley was $4.50. But that was later. I presume it was less than that at that time.
Yeah.
I am sorry to say that I had an argument with one of my passengers. I was a bus driver for a while before I learned better. And, there was a tour conductor that said he didn't need a ticket. He didn't need a cash fare. That he was supposed to be carried free. And I said, "Well, I'm sorry, mister, but our strict orders are a cash fare, a ticket, or a pass. And you can't ride on my bus because I haven't got $4.50 to pay your fare." Well, the manager of the Stanley called the office, and Roy Emery, the manager down there, said, "Roy, I forgot to tell you." He said, "Pass him, it's okay." But $4.50 looked pretty big in those days.
When did you and your wife meet?
You tell them. How did we meet?
Well, I don't remember. I guess in about 1914, 13 or 14, I came up in 1914 to play at the picture show, the Park Theater, for the silent movies, the first year it was built. It was built by a man named Jackson, and he was the brother of Mrs. Lewis. They ran the Lewiston Hotel. And I played there for about 4 years, I guess, and he sold it to Ralph Gwynn. And I still played for Ralph Gwynn until the silent movies went off and the talkies came in. Well, I just played summers for a while. They just had the show open in the summer. And then we were married in 1918. That was 4 years later. And Ralph Gwynn still had the movies, and I still played for it then. In 1918, I still played for silent movies. Estes Park has changed a lot since I came in here. We had some experiences. In 1919, we spent the first winter here. And some years later than that, we didn't have electricity all night. Everybody had to hurry home by 12 o'clock because the lights went off. And one year, we didn't have it only 2 hours a day, and that was in the morning. Everybody used their lamps. And they just depended on the water to run electricity, and they didn't have any water that year, so they just had a little bit. I remember one year that we didn't have water for a while. The main froze, the whole main. There was 6 weeks, the whole town was without water. Well, we had the advantage of the others because we lived by the river. And we chopped a hole in the ice and got our water, and everybody else came down there to get water too. Got water out of the river for 6 weeks, hauled their water, until the main was fixed. That was quite an experience.
Here again?
Should be on.
Roy, excuse me, could you tell us a little about Lord Dunraven and
Well,
his,
He quit raving before I came here.
he was pretty Baldwin.
He was kind of a scoundrel in some people's opinion. By hook or crook, he acquired, or at least thought he had acquired, a good many acres of ground. I've forgotten how many acres. I think in the neighborhood of 12,000 acres, something like that. His aim was to make a hunting preserve here for he and his English friends. And it was said that he hired men to prove up on a certain piece of ground, and some way or another they acquired title to it, and they found out afterward when they contested some of these that nobody made any improvements, which we were supposed to do according to law, and live on the land a certain length of time. They gave you some time off because they knew that it was hard to stay on a piece of ground without you had to get out and work someplace. The Irishman story is that Uncle Sam bet you 160 acres of land against 5 years of your time that you couldn't live there without starving to death. And that was pretty well expressed it, because sledding was kind of hard in those days, and it was hard to make a living, and lots of people would go and maybe build a fence or a barn or a house on their ground, and then go away and get a job part of the year somewhere else. So he was considered pretty much of a knave, but he did, I think, in a way, get Estes Park before the public and get it known. He was instrumental in getting some building done here, and I've been told that John Cleve, who had the first little store and one of the first post offices, I don't say the first one, but one of the first post offices, he was the postmaster. The post office, when I came here, was down in the center of town, but I was told that before that it had been out in the neighborhood of the McGregor Ranch. It's been moved several times, to my knowledge. It was in a small building just this side of the drugstore. That's the Estes Park drugstore. And it was moved, I think, around the corner from that, and John had just a little bit of a store and carried a few groceries, and it was moved down the street where it was a good many years, and then moved back up into what was the saloon last summer. It had various names. So the post office has had several moves, and every time everybody was madder than hops. Just get used to going to one place, and now I've got to walk clear down there to get my mail. But when it was moved back approximately where it was before, they were mad again. People resent change. They get in a habit, and they don't want to be moved. And we're no different than the rest. Quite a number of years ago, Ralph McDonald, who owned the laundry at that time, built a square building just north of our property. Boy, were we mad about it. Couldn't see a thing for that building. It was disgrace to the town, built out of sheet metal, and we went on, but we got used to it. And my son, being a painter, he donated paint and painted two sides of it that we could see. And after a while, time brings changes, and they tore it down and moved it away, and we were mad again. People resent change of any kind.
Roy, was there a doctor here when you first came?
Not when I first came. If there's everybody had their home remedies, and everybody was neighborly in those days. If they heard that John Jones was sick, why, they would go over to see if they could help with the chores or nurse somebody or anything like that. They were very neighborly people in those days. If a man was badly hurt or was an emergency, they made a bed in a spring wagon and hitched up the fastest horses they could find and rushed him to the valley. But those old home remedies were pretty good, and everybody carried a stock of medicines that they thought they would need.
Who was your first doctor here?
Well, Dr. Workman used to come every summer, and he stayed and owned property and owned a summer place beyond where Stead's Hotel was. And he was a summer doctor, and there were other summer doctors, but in the winter we were pretty much alone, and I guess, of course, Dr. James, one of the Jameses, Howard James's brother, was a doctor. But it was a funny thing. Doc, as we called him then, he get out of doctoring if he could. He didn't want to be a doctor, but his family insisted that he'd go and take a course in doctoring. But he always seemed to find something he had to do immediately if anybody wanted to call a doctor.
Well, I remember Dr. Dixon. Wasn't he here about then when our children were little?
Yes, he was here.
About what year would that have been? About?
1925, somewhere around there.
What about Dr. Weiss?
But Dr. Weiss, I think, was probably the first permanent doctor that we
A
had.
little bit late.
Dr. Weiss.
But I remember Dr. Dixon used to, I don't know, he lived up on the hill someplace there. I can't think just where it was. But he took out kids' tonsils, most of the kids around town, and things like that.
Kids didn't like him very well.
He would go in the homes and operate on the table.
Yes, on the kitchen table. Roy forgot to mention about the Stanley Hotel. The foundation of that was built from rock from the Baldwin place. They hauled rock from his folks' place.
That is in the days of wagons, of course, and horses. That was before many trucks. And there was a good many wagon loads of rock that was hauled off the old Baldwin place, which, as I say, is near Beaver Point and is in the foundation of the Stanley Hotel to this day.
Do you remember I've heard the nicest story and read the nicest story about when they built the front room on the library in 1922. Do you remember that?
Well, I remember it being done, yes.
Uh-huh.
Roy, what about the wildlife when you were a boy here? Were there any animals here then that aren't here now? And was there just a great abundance of everything?
There had been a lot of elk, but for some reason they had migrated out of here. If you were here up until a few years ago, you probably remember the big stack of elk horns that was out at the front there. It was also out at Stead's, a great stack of them. And they could be picked up on the hillsides, which show that there had been a great many elk here, but for some reason or another they had migrated out of this country. There were lots of deer, and we had bobcats and coyotes and the usual array of small animals. Probably a lot more than we have today, because civilization and wildlife don't agree too good. The coyote, however, is an exception to that. They don't seem to be worried about civilization, and there's more coyotes today than there's ever been. Everybody had to watch their chicken coops those days because coyotes like fresh chicken.
What about mountain lions? Were there many?
There were a few. They were seen occasionally, and they were hunted with dogs and so on, but not many of them.
I remember when I first came here, sheep, mountain sheep, were just as common as deer and elk are now. You just saw them everywhere.
Especially in Horseshoe Park and around the Mary's Lake country. There were a lot of them, and then they got some disease and killed off lots of them. There were very few for several years, and then they started coming back.
The deer used to come down so much in the evening, especially in the winter time, right in our yard to the river to drink. They'd come down from Davis Hill. There were no buildings on Davis Hill then. And that was just a big hill. And they would come down there and in our yard and cross our yard to drink at the river.
And when it froze over, they crossed the river on the ice.
Did the settlers hunt the deer very much for meat? I mean, was that the chief staple of the diet in the wintertime, or?
They told me that before I lived here, that some men made quite a living out of killing deer and elk in those days and taking it to the valley towns or even to Denver and selling them. And they tell a story about a painter who had quite a large family and lived in the north part of Estes Park, in the north part of the town there. And his youngsters got to feeding the deer potato peelings and apple peelings, and in the spring he said, I believe those things must have poisoned those deer, because he said last fall there was 13 of them, and he said now there's only 5.
I can't help but insert this because I remember at the outset you said this was mostly then and a little bit of now. Since I wasn't here then, but I am here now, Mrs. Baldwin was mentioning that the deer come down and drank out of the stream. We have been fortunate enough, even yet, living right across the street from the Catholic Church, to watch a doe for the last 2 years with her 2 young fawn. Bring them down, they go onto the golf course, and they do drink, even yet.
The deer soon loses their fear of civilization.
Sure.
If they find they aren't being harmed, why, they soon learn that there's nothing to fear.
What's the story about the elk being shipped in by Mr. Stanley?
Well, I don't think it was entirely Mr. Stanley. I think it was mostly the people of the town got the idea that too many elk in Wyoming, no elk here, maybe they could acquire some of them. Now, what channels they went through to get them, I don't know, but they built racks on Stanley steamers, and they were shipped, I suppose, in cattle cars, and then hauled up here on those Stanley steamers that's taken the seats out and built racks on them so they could haul them. And at first they were kept out here, the Moore property. It had the big posts and then an arm out onto that with a barbed wire on there. And they were kept in there for a while. Of course, that being private property, I think they had to make arrangements to pasture them there till they sort of got acquainted and got acclimated here. But I don't remember how many were shipped, but I think they lost very few. They did real well. And of course now we have elk everywhere.
Do you remember anything about the fire that destroyed the so-called English hotel, the Estes Park Hotel at Lord Dundee?
Yeah, I was a pretty small youngster. I didn't go to the hotel fire, although I guess I was about the only one that didn't. It was quite an event in those days. And it seems that there's an argument about when that fire happened. I think and still maintain that it burned in the early part of the summer of 1912. However, some historians say that it was in the fall of 1911. But I still think it was in early summer, and I suppose the year was 1912. They don't agree as to how it caught fire. Some say that it was an employee that had been discharged and was disgruntled and set the attic afire. However, they didn't have much firefighting equipment in those days, and in spite of their efforts, it burned to the ground. The Lewiston Hotel fire is another one that's, you hear all sorts of stories about how it happened. I was away at the time. I was working in Cheyenne, Wyoming on a cantonment, a camp that they were building there to enlarge the Army. And on the way home, we stopped at Wellington to get some gasoline, and when I went into the office to pay the bill, well, here was the newspaper spread out. Stanley, the Lewiston Hotel in Estes Park burns. So I was quite astonished, but the general theory seems to be it was an electrical short that started it, because the switchboard, they said, just all lit up at once, and they couldn't pinpoint the fire for a little while, but it seemed to be electric trouble that they blamed it on.
I think that's about all I can remember.
Well, there was one thing in those days that's still true today. Everybody here thought Estes Park was the grandest place in the world.
And we still do.
Mrs. Baldwin brought something in tonight to give to the museum, and I'd like to have her tell about it.
Well, there isn't very much to tell. I didn't know I was going to tell about it. I just thought it's laying around the house, and I don't use it. Maybe somebody would like it. I've had it stowed away. I did take it out and wash it. It was made by my grandmother in about 1870. And my mother kept it, and she says, always keep this. It's just one of these little knit chair tidies, I guess they call them. And I thought if the museum wants it, they can have it.
Thank you very much. Any other questions?
We should give them a good hand.
We'll have some refreshments, and you can stand around and talk and ask more questions if you want to.
I can still say I don't know.
Now, and
Now that